We're going to start this week's videos with the mask tool. We're going to cover the rest of these icons in the second part of the Mach 3 overview. And I've covered the mask tool in several other videos. There's one on trims and trimmable, trimming irregular quilt edges, and we've touched on it in several of the, I think the edge to edge video. So there's lots of places that we've sort of reviewed this, but we'll kind of start over on this one and explain it. So to use the mask tool, you have several different options of, say, tracing around an applique on your quilt. You can do that with the push pin boundary, and I'll say mouse placement, but normally you'd be using the head to do it, and you want to say close when done because masks have to be closed shapes or else they don't work. And I'll go ahead and say start. I'd be using the head to trace around the applique, but I'll just do the same thing here, pretending like I have an applique, and I'll trace the star and get close to the end line and then say done, and it closes it up. Now, if you use the push pin boundary, by definition, the push pin boundaries are locked and DQ'd. And it can be hard to select this because the pattern actually sits over it, but you can right click and go to your group manager. And I have it set up for newest first. And so here's my push pin boundary. If I expand that, I can go in and choose unlocked and queued, and it turns it into basically a sewable pattern, but I can now use that as a mask. And the next couple of steps are the same no matter how you build a mask. But the second way you can build a mask is you could use the draw menu. And I'll come down here. Normally, again, you'd be doing it from the sew head. I'm going to do it from the mouse on the screen. And you could choose your segment types and say begin. And I'll come in here and do my other wonky star. And I want to say close when done, and then done. And so that's also created a shape around appliques. So you've got a couple different options. The third option is that you actually go into the mask tool and say create a region. And so we'll just do a triangle for this one. If when you click, it seems like nothing has happened on your first click. It's not until your second click that you see that line develop. Third click, and then I'll say complete region, and it will close that and selects it to be purple, which is the next step for all three of these. So once it does that, you're going to click it again on the edge, and you will have it turn pink, and then you'll click the pattern that you want to create a mask. So in this case, it's the second pattern. And I'm going to choose inside and continuous sew. I don't generally sew mask outlines because you can end up with a lot of overstitching. And then I'll say accept, and it's going to take the stitching out of that, what is an applique shape on my quilt. So let's do this one, the push pin boundary. The steps are the same. I select it first and say build. Turns it purple, touch the edge of it to turn it pink. I'll say sew mask outline on this situation, and we have inside. I have to select the pattern that I want to mask and then say accept. And so on this situation, this one would actually stitch the outline. So this would be the same thing. So that's how you create a mask. We have done it along the edge of a quilt for irregular edges. Go back and watch that video because it's pretty handy if you're dealing with a quilt that you don't want to stitch off the edge with. Next, let's do an inside mask or an outside mask. We're going to cut away what's outside of a shape. So I'm going to go in and draw a letter. You could use any shape that you want, but I am in the draw menu, and I'll go ahead and pick this Comic Sans, and we'll do a K, and I'll say create text, and it comes down here at the bottom. So these things need to be in your sew zone for the tools to work. So I'll go ahead and maybe expand that just a little bit. I'm going to use this as my mask. I've created just a small edge to edge, or using multiply, of a pattern by Deb Geisler that we use all the time called Deb Swirls, which is on our website. So I'll go ahead and bring my letter that I've created over those patterns and go to the mask tool, and I have the letter selected, and I say build. It turns it purple. Select the edge of it again to turn it pink, and then you have to select the pattern that you want, and I'll choose outside, continuous sew, and in this situation I'll go ahead and sew the entire mask outline and say accept, and then I'll go back and choose the second pattern, do the same thing. And so now I have a letter filled with some neat fill. And because of the way the pattern was designed, there are going to be a couple starts and stops. Even though I had continuous sew, let's go ahead and choose to watch that stitch out. Sometimes if they're too far apart, it would have to retrace the shape too long, and so it will actually break the pattern a little bit. But we'll go ahead and say start on the sewing preview, and we can watch how that goes. I can speed that up a little bit. So just because of the way the pattern was designed, it does have some what we call jump stitches, where it's going to tie off and go back around. So not a problem. I'd rather have it do that than overstitch too much. So it goes ahead and completes that. So that is the mask tool. Let's go over the measure tool. So I'm going to click on that. This is a handy tool. You don't need to go get a tape measure. You've got a very sophisticated computer and machine that you can use instead. And let's say that the customer has told me that their quilt is one size, but I'm doubting it and I want to remeasure before I set up the patterns. So you can go ahead and do it from the sew head or the mouse. I'm going to do it from the mouse in this situation. And we'll just say free. And I'll go ahead and check the box that says show ruler if you want to see that. So I could measure from one side of their quilt using the sew head to the other side of their quilt. And in this case, I find out that it's 40 and they had told me it was 43. So I could reset up the quilt patterns to fit the actual measurements of their quilts. So that's the free measure tool. These next three options in your measure tool work basically the same way. You can either click in two places on your quilt or on your computer screen to measure areas and set it up to measure pattern to points or pattern to pattern on your quilt. Where I see these being useful is if you were in the middle of an edge to edge and you shut down for the night and you forgot to save it, you can go and measure the actual sewing on the quilt to get some of these references in order to set up the quilt again. So this would be a way for you to recover if you didn't save a project and you needed to scale the patterns to the same measurements to continue to complete the quilt. Next up is the Morph tool, and it's another way that you can manipulate patterns to fit odd shapes. And so let me bring in, say, this pattern, which is pretty square, into this block on a customer's quilt that is not square. So you could use the boundary tool, but remember that only gives you 4 clicks for the corners, and in this situation it's got a little bump out on the side too, so this is really off. So I usually get the pattern pretty close to where I want it, and then you can use the Morph tool and actually come in here and pull any of these multiple handles to get it the way you want. So you can really manipulate the pattern to get it to fit into an odd shape. So very handy when you're trying to fit things into piecing that's not always super accurate. And I'm doing it with the mouse. You can also do it with the sew head, although it's a little bit harder to manipulate. So I generally will do a boundary to show on my screen and then manipulate it from the mouse. So the positioning tool gives you some options on moving patterns around into different locations on your quilt. And I think the easiest way to see how this works is to actually go ahead and use the sew head. So I've got sew head selected, and I'm going to put it over close to this pattern. And on my screen, on my lightning stitch screen, it actually says grab. And so I will select grab, and it will put the pattern, lock it to my sew head in this situation in the center. And now when I move my sew head, I can drag the pattern to where I want it, and the screen now says drop. The lower button on the Mach 3 screen says drop. So if I click drop, then I can, clearly didn't click it. then I can move my sew head and that pattern is no longer locked to the sew head. So it's just a way to drag things and drop them in different places. We've used push pins in a lot of these videos. It's a way of just showing on your computer screen exactly where things are on the quilt. So you can create them by the mouse or with the actual sew head. And I tend to close them when done because I'm usually tracing around a block or an applique shape, and connect while placing, but those are things that you can uncheck if you want. So I've traced around some shapes on the quilt, and I can also just, build a shape on the screen if I wanted to. And so very handy to be able to really accurately line things up. We use them all day, every day. And a couple other options, if I want to remove an individual pin, I can click here and it will take that pin away so I can see a corner a little bit better, or I can remove them all and then I end up with these really clean lines. I kind of wish this was the default, that putting in the pins was an option, because sometimes they get in my way, but you can use it either way you want that serves your purpose. And then this is kind of a slick little tool down here. If I want to find a center between two pins, I can click on two pins on a shape and it's going to give me a center point. So that's where I could go back and use the positioning tool or just drag and drop a pattern onto that center to line things up. So that can be valuable if you're working on a block that doesn't have a visual center, if you're trying to center a pattern. Just a quick extra note on the push pin function is that push pins are locked and dequeued. By definition, push pin boundaries, and you want to actually reposition your patterns on your screen before you create a push pin boundary, because it's going to move with your patterns when you do reposition. So what I mean by that is, if I was coming down to the end of the quilt and I wanted to create a push pin boundary here, I would want to make sure that I've repositioned the patterns first. Because if I do the push pin boundary first and then reposition the patterns, the boundary is going to move and it would no longer reflect the actual edge of the quilt. So if you go back and watch my video on dealing with sort of wonky edges on quilts, I think that would be clear. Just remember to reposition first and then use your push pins. Let's talk about the split tool. So there's this pattern that comes with your machine that's incredibly detailed. It would be kind of a pain to actually stitch out, because you look at some of these tiny little elements and you can't, run it very large. It has to fit in your sew field. So those are really going to take a long time to stitch out. But maybe I just want this little koala. So let's use the split tool to pull that out. So if I come in here, I can divide a pattern in one place using the divide option. If I wanted to just divide it here, click on it, say accept. Now, this part of the pattern is separated from the other part of the pattern, but let's go ahead and Control Z to undo that, and I'll create a segment. So if I come in on this koala and click in two spots and say accept, he's now a separate unit. So I can then manipulate him however I want to and save him as a separate pattern, do whatever you want to do if you want to reuse him for another project. Okay, next up is the trim tool. So I can go ahead and click on that. And this is a great way to, let me go back to transform so you can see it. This customer gave me measurements for this quilt and I didn't check it. So the measurements that I put in actually sew off my sew zone. So none of these patterns would actually send because it goes beyond the safe zone on my quilt. So I could use the measure tool and reset up the project, or I could go ahead and just trim this. I'll do it with the mouse, but you could also do it with the head. I'll choose the trim, and I'm going to choose a vertical trim, and I'm going to choose it from the mouse. So I'll bring my mouse over my head and actually click at the edge of the pattern, or edge of the quilt, and that's going to turn these patterns over here orange. If it actually turned these orange, that's not what I want to trim away. I want to trim away what's on the outside of the quilt. So you say invert, and you can choose entire quilt or just current selection. If I have that picked, whatever you want to trim. if it's a measurement mistake, I tend to do the entire quilt. And I can select clip connect, which means that it's going to sew continuously. It won't stop and jump to the next section. So I'll have that selected and say accept, and it just resized the pattern. So now if I get out of there, you can see that it found a new way to travel and will handle this without a lot of tie-offs. So really slick option on the quilt. And you can, in trim, also choose an angle. Like if I was down here, let me choose horizontal, at the bottom of the quilt, but it was more of a little bit of an angle, I can actually rotate this and say accept, and it would cut it off at that angle. If there's too many irregularities in it, though, go back and watch my other video on trimming irregular edges, because we can actually use some more sophisticated tools to do that. Most of us use the transform tools all the time. Some people refer to them as stretchy man, and lots of different options that it will just start at the top. So if I want to resize something, I can uncheck maintain ratio and use these corner handles or these side handles to alter it any way that I want. I'm going to Control Z to undo that to get it back to its original. And if you have maintain ratio, wherever I select the corner, it's going to maintain the original ratio as it was designed originally. So you can use the 2-point resize, and if I click over here in the first point, it places it, and then automatically my mouse is connected to this lower corner. So that will resize it. I can click again and it will be placed. You can adjust things by their measurements. So if I actually wanted this to be square, I could put in 9.5 and it would square that pattern up a little bit if that's what I wanted. If I didn't have maintain ratio. If you maintain the ratio and try to change one, the other one is going to change automatically. Moving down on these menu items, we'll go to rotate next. And I wanted to mention that there's a little minus button here. If you click that, it minimizes the menu. And so you can shrink this up if you want. I'll go ahead and expand it again to show all those. But if for some reason you can't find a tool, you might have clicked that. So if we come in here and I uncheck lock rotation and have 0 put in on the custom, I can grab this rotation handle and rotate it. And in the angle box, you'll watch that change. It tells me what angle I'm actually rotating that. So it can give me some information if I need that. Control Z to undo that. You can change the rotation point. Again, I'm going to unlock the rotation step. And you get these little buttons, and I can click on that and it will change the rotation to the point where I clicked. Let me go back and do that again. So I can also click in the middle of an area and that now becomes my rotation area. So that can be pretty handy when you're doing some digitizing and planning some quilt patterns. So moving down there, I can lock it if I want it to only move at a 45-degree angle. And I can say clockwise or counterclockwise. It will rotate things for me at that set angle, at that locked angle. And I tend to leave it at a really small amount because sometimes I just really want to angle something a tiny little bit. So I leave it at this 0.03, or you could put in, 0 or whatever you want. So I think that covers pretty much all of the rotate options. Nudge is super handy. So if you need to move something, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard, or you can use the sort of the same setup here. So if I want to just nudge something a little bit, let's say 1/8 of an inch, I can say right, up, and just scoot things around, or I can use my keypad arrows and do the same thing. So I tend to leave it a really small amount because I like to just move it tiny increments. But you can customize that and do whatever you need to be able to nudge things around your screen. So scrolling down on the screen, the next area we have is flip. And so I pull this pattern in that's really obvious if it's upside down. I can flip it horizontally, or I could flip it vertically. So it just allows you to mirror or reflect, and those tools are also up here in this top menu. So you've got them in several different locations. And then down here towards the bottom, if I want to reverse the sew direction, you'll notice the way it's designed is how edge-to-edge patterns usually are, where it starts on the left, ends on the right on the same horizontal plane. I can reverse that by clicking this button. So now it would start on the right and end up on the left. And then finally, we have pattern center. So let me bring another pattern back on. If I, for some reason, wanted to find the center, obviously the rotation handle is there, but I could also click pattern center, and it locks in some guides that would help me be able to place patterns. And you can place them to your sew head. If you put that in the middle of a block someplace, you could then drag this and line it up with that midpoint. So it allows you to be real precise with your pattern placement. So that's it for the transform options. So we covered the Wreath tool pretty extensively in a previous video, but I'll just go over it very briefly here. If I have a pattern and I just drew this in the draw menu, just a simple diamond shape, and I've got the start and end down here. They're not perfectly aligned, but it won't really matter for what we're doing. I can go to the Wreath tool, and I'm going to put in 8 repeats and do a 45-degree rotation because that's a circle divided by 8. And I have 0 chosen from the center, so everything will line up at these same points. And then I want to check rotation point, and if you come over here or change rotation, you'll see that this circle develops, and I want that rotation to be down here at the bottom. So I'll click there. Now I want to choose link patterns so it becomes 1 unit rather than staying 8 separate units, and I'll say preview, and so it creates this pattern. So if I say accept, I now have a pattern that has 1 start and stop and will stitch out as one circular array, or what INNOVA calls it is a wreath. So very fun to play with. You know, you just have to kind of experiment to get the effect that you want with it, but pretty powerful if you want to create either block patterns or something to fill a circle or anything else that you would need as a wreath.